January 17, 1994, Los Angeles, California. The second largest city in the United States is rocked by a moderate-sized earthquake. The epicenter is in the Los Angeles suburb of Northridge. It lasts only 10 seconds, but kills 57 people. In the quake's aftermath, seismologists from all over the world descend on Northridge. Among them is a contingent from Japan. The visitors from across the Pacific could hardly have imagined that they too were in for a seismic wake-up call. In an eerie coincidence, it would come on the same date, January 17th, exactly 1 year later. Kobe, Japan lies on Osaka Bay, 280 miles southwest of Tokyo. It is part of the second largest urban area in Japan. Here is one of the most active seaports in the world. 1/3 of all of Japan's trade passes through its modern harbor. Kobe's beauty and international stature attract people from all over the world. One of them was Vani Lin Wong, a young English teacher from Los Angeles who came to Kobe and settled in an older section of the city. Many of these densely packed neighborhoods feature houses with the traditional tile roofs. Ogi Takatoshi and his family lived in one of them. In the spring of 1994, a young girl planted a few sunflower seeds in her family's garden. The seed she sowed would later become a source of inspiration for Kobe's residents. The morning of January 17, 1995, started like any other in Kobe's fish market. Merchants are trading the latest catch, just as they have for generations. It is one of the city's many time-honored traditions that coexist with modern technology. In moments, this delicate balance would be upset by a major earthquake. It would reshape not only the landscape, but also Japan's ancient culture. It started when the clock in the fish market struck 5:46. The 20 terrifying seconds are captured by a security camera. The quake is recorded forever in human memory.
I thought we were going to die. I really thought that I was going to die. I was very, very sure that the ceiling will come down and it will just press us.
Within seconds, the darkness is broken by the flames of multiple fires. Shortly after dawn, a more complete picture of the damage is seen. The shaking has brought down many traditional homes, while people like Ogi Takatoshi are still in their beds. He is buried alive in the ruins of his house, like thousands of others all over the city. The affluent Ashiya district, one of Kobe's oldest neighborhoods, has also been decimated. Vani Lin Wong was living in this house when it collapsed. Halfway around the world in Los Angeles, her parents nervously begin calling Kobe as soon as they hear of the earthquake.
We call until like middle morning, like 3:30, 4 o'clock.
And we couldn't get through. And then I just all of a sudden, I just says, "Dear God, please keep her safe in the arms of Jesus."
Even people in Japan can't reach Kobe. The city hasn't seen an earthquake this strong for hundreds of years. Local policemen perform the first rescues, but they too are shocked.
I had never experienced an earthquake. I thought I was used to dealing with crisis situations, but it was very difficult to deal with the earthquake rescues. Somehow, we had to forget about the emotions we had in order to do the work.
Kobe is now in a state of chaos. The city's narrow streets are gridlocked, and its emergency response system is overwhelmed.
This system was not enough. We didn't expect such a big earthquake will hit us, so we didn't develop effective system of mutual cooperation. But actually, our city experienced a temporary isolation from the rest of Japan.
For the most part, Kobe's 1.5 million residents are on their own. Local and national authorities are unable to help them. Television cameras, however, are out in force, beaming the first images of the devastated area to the Japanese capital.
I was in Tokyo at the time as the Tokyo correspondent for the LA Times. And in Tokyo, as in California, you're getting constantly rattled by earthquakes. So if you feel a little tremor, it's really no big deal. And I think that we did feel a tremor that morning. But the difference was that I turned on the TV and I saw the most incredible shot of the Hanshin Freeway completely toppled over on its side. And I said, oh no, this is going to be a big one.
The Hanshin Expressway, Kobe's main traffic route, is thrown on its side. Above the crushed cars, a busload of skiers. Safe, only inches from disaster. But the death toll is climbing. Soon it will number thousands. At railway stations, steel tracks are twisted like spaghetti. All over town, high-rise buildings are toppled over. Others tilted at drunken angles. Some buildings, seemingly at random, have lost entire floors. For some, it is a flashback to World War II, when the city was nearly destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people are homeless. Others can't get out of their homes. By mid-morning, Ogi Takatoshi has been trapped for 4 hours.
I was caught with my legs underneath the table. When the second floor collapsed onto me, the table kind of protected me. I was stuck in that position. My legs felt numb, and they turned all white.
The danger for trapped victims such as Ogi Takatoshi is that flames could arrive before rescuers. More than 50 separate fires began in the first minutes after the earthquake. Now, many of them are out of control.
We just wanted to find people, as many survivors as we could rescue, not bodies. That was the only thing we had in mind.
The amount of damage suggests a large magnitude earthquake. But the first reports from scientists indicate a medium-sized temblor, magnitude 6.9, almost identical to the Northridge quake of a year earlier.
I think it was a horrifying experience for the Japanese to find themselves in the position they were, much like we were. And in fact, despite the fact that the Kobe earthquake is nominally larger than Northridge, as far as the town of Kobe is concerned, the earthquakes are almost the same size at the same distance.
Yet Kobe has been dealt a much larger blow. This despite Japan's reputation as the most quake-savvy nation in the world. Their engineers are known for designing safe buildings. So why has Kobe suffered so much more than Los Angeles from a similar-sized jolt? For the people of Kobe, there is a more urgent question. When will help arrive? For several hours after the quake, there is little response from Tokyo. Initial reports of damage have heightened the authorities' confusion because there is no clear plan of action. Part of the problem is that Kobe officials are hesitant to ask for help. Their reluctance can be explained by an ancient tradition.
The Japanese have a concept called soto uchi. Soto is outside, uchi is inside. And what it means is that if you're in a group, you're considered an insider, and everybody outside of your group is considered an outsider. And you don't want to show the outsiders problems that are going on in the inner group. The local government didn't necessarily want the national government to come in and bigfooting all over the turf and dictating what they should and should not do.
Precious hours pass. The world's attention is focused on the plight of Kobe's people. Among those anxiously following the events is the California family of Vani Lin Wong. They still haven't been able to reach their daughter. Telephone lines are down, and Kobe is burning. Water mains have burst from the shaking, leaving citizens without water and firemen without adequate pressure. Fire engines are having a difficult time weaving their way through narrow streets clogged with rubble. Other cities have been destroyed by earthquake and fire. San Francisco in 1906, Tokyo in 1923. Kobe appears to be next. Who will save the city by Osaka Bay? Kobe, Japan, the afternoon of January 17, 1995. 142 major fires are burning. Kobe typically doesn't have this many fires in 2 months. The flames are also much bigger than what the firefighters usually face.
About half of the firemen also affected, and some of them lost their family members. And all the traffic systems are disrupted, and water supply was disrupted, and we couldn't had any idea of this size of the damage before the earthquake really happened to us.
Kobe's firefighters are handicapped in battling the flames because they are short of water. They also have to help rescue the many still trapped in the rubble. By mid-afternoon, some residents have been buried over 8 hours. Inside his collapsed home, Ogi Takatoshi has completely lost feeling in his legs.
They had to go and get 3 other people to bring a crane to remove the rubble on top of me. Finally, they got me out. I really think it was a miracle.
But the Ashiya district of Kobe isn't so fortunate. Many older-style homes have been crushed, including the residence of Vani Lin Wong. The second floor has collapsed on her room. Her anxious housemates wonder if she was home at the time of the earthquake. Those residents lucky enough to escape from the rubble have nowhere to go.
People were just shell-shocked. I mean, they were walking around with these dumbfounded looks on their face. A lot of them were clutching bags, shopping bags just filled with a few clothes. There wasn't anything to eat. There was no running water. There was no heat.
School gymnasiums are being used as shelters, but they are filling up quickly.
People were waiting. People sat around and waited for someone to tell them what to do. And in the confusion of the earthquake, nobody was telling them what to do. They were just lined up in the gymnasiums with blankets and futons and things like that. And so there was this contrast between the orderliness of the public and the physical devastation of the city.
I did my doctorate in Japan. I've lived there a total of 7 years. One of the things that is different in Japan is there's much more time required to arrive at a consensus as to what to do. So as a generality, this means that Japanese society is slower to respond to crises than the U.S. On the other hand, when they do respond, it's a careful, thought-out, very effective response.
Once the government reaches a consensus, the Prime Minister orders the army to the disaster zone. Several crucial hours have already been lost, and it will be 4 days before the troops are fully deployed. Few people in Kobe can wait that long. Yet another controversy is brewing. Several nations have pledged their support. International rescue teams arrive in Kobe, only to be frustrated by the bureaucracy.
At the moment, we can't seem to get onto the sites. There are sites, but it seems to be, the problem seems to be finding out where they are. We can't seem to find anybody that can give us the yes, you can go to it.
Japanese doctors have their own frustrations. One physician has tried to get military helicopters to evacuate patients, only to be bogged down by red tape.
First he had to go to the fire department. The fire department then had to go to the health department. The health department then had to go to the governor's office. The governor's office then had to go to the military. And he said by that time, how many people had died?
Amid the confusion, the people of Kobe have begun taking matters in their own hands, pioneering something new in Japanese society.
We knew that the government won't be able to provide all the necessary blankets, or soup, or anything, so we became like a village people. To survive as a lone person is very, very difficult during the disaster period, and I realized the power of people relating to each other. Then the surviving was much easier.
Volunteerism is not as common in Japan as in other societies. But because of the quake, a major cultural change is taking place.
What you had in Kobe was people just coming in from all over the country, major corporations letting their employees take time off to go down and help out in the earthquake. You had students pouring in to try and help in any way they could.
We came here, we just had a few bags of bread, and then people saw us giving out bread, and some other aid agencies came by and gave us boxes and boxes of food and drinks and bread and milk, as much as we could handle to pass out to the people.
Help is also arriving from a surprising source, the Yakuza, or Japanese mafia. The gangsters were among the first to distribute food and water in Kobe.
They just left the materials on street corner or the shelters, stating this is a donation from #1 mafia families.
The Yakuza got involved because they said that they were members of the Kobe community and their community was in need, and this was their chance to show that they aren't these horrible gangsters, but, you know, concerned citizens.
As outside help begins to arrive, the Yakuza fade back into the shadows of the Japanese underworld. The day following the earthquake, the many fires around the city are beginning to burn out. Aftershocks continue to rumble throughout Kobe, and authorities are warning people against returning to their damaged homes. In Los Angeles, California, after 24 anxious hours, the family of Vonnie Lin Wong receives the phone call they have been dreading from one of her roommates.
Lori said she was very sorry to report, to let us know that out of the 6 of them, Vonnie was the only one that didn't make it.
I guess the basic information was that the house collapsed and the whole neighborhood was devastated, and she was buried under the debris, and she did not survive.
And so we just took the news and says, well, Lord, I guess it's your will. And we accepted it.
Scientists were now beginning to understand why Kobe suffered such a savage blow. They pinpointed the epicenter of the quake in the narrow strait between the city of Kobe and Awaji Island. When the fault snapped, much of the energy went directly under downtown Kobe. Part of the fault line can be seen. It is the main exhibit in this museum near the epicenter. This crack shows the immense power of a merely average-sized earthquake.
What was stunning about the Kobe earthquake is that such a small earthquake could cause so much damage and loss. Only the part that ruptured to the north ruptured toward the city of Kobe. That part of the earthquake is smaller than the Northridge size event. It's barely over a magnitude 6.5, and that killed 6,000 people and caused about $100 billion of damage.
Japanese scientists were not only shocked by the Kobe earthquake, they were chagrined, especially after seeing the damage caused by the Northridge quake.
They were pretty confident, almost cocky, that this was not their fate, that their structures were stronger than ours, that they had developed a much higher level of preparation, that people knew what to do more than our people know what to do. And so I think it was a bitter blow for Japanese to discover that the consequences of the earthquake would be so great.
It was especially bitter because the Japanese are the most earthquake-conscious people in the world. Why had Kobe suffered so much more than Northridge from a similar-sized earthquake? January 23, 1995, Kobe, Japan. A teenage volunteer, one of many helping with the city's recovery, records his impressions of the earthquake's aftermath.
6 days to the hour after the quake destroyed the city. It's 7 o'clock, almost 7 o'clock in the morning. And as you can see, this is quite a desolate looking place.
One week earlier, Kobe was one of the sparkling jewels of modern Japan. Now, it looks like a ghost town. There is still no water. The director of Kobe's water department will later commit suicide over the failure of the system. There is no heat. The gas isn't on even at the city's crematoriums. They cannot dispose of the bodies, which now number over 6,000. By now, the Japanese army has arrived in force. Slowly, a sense of organization has emerged. They are helping to distribute supplies as well as search for bodies. After a slow start, the Japanese machine is now fully engaged.
I remember going to the Kobe City Hall and seeing their command center, and they had it all charted out. You know, this is how many lines we have down, this is what we're working on, this is what we expect. And so again, the Japanese, initially in a crisis, there is confusion over who's going to lead and all of that. Once they get their plan down, once they decide what needs to be done, then because it is such a cooperative society, things run fairly smoothly.
By the time Prime Minister Murayama visits Kobe, the city's recovery is underway. But many residents are now questioning the government's response.
We ran into a lot of people who were quite disillusioned. I remember one man bustling into an interview that I conducted, saying, "What I want to tell the world is that Japan has a fifth-rate government." And so I think to some extent the people's trust in the government was shaken.
The Prime Minister's visit marks the beginning of change. Eventually, the national government will revise emergency procedures to prevent delays in earthquake response. In a solemn act of atonement, Japan's cabinet ministers would pledge a month's salary, about $10,000 each, for quake relief. By the spring, the rubble had been cleared away, and the cherry trees were in bloom throughout Kobe. On an empty lot where a house once stood, a sunflower also bloomed. A remarkable sight, because sunflowers are rare in Japan. It had been planted by the 10-year-old girl. She was one of the quake's 6,000 victims. Like many, she had died when the ceiling of her room collapsed. To the girl's family, the sunflower was a sign from their departed daughter. Other people who heard the story were also touched. Sunflowers were planted throughout Japan in sympathy for the people of Kobe. Yet many continue to wonder, why had Kobe been so devastated by a medium-sized earthquake? Part of the answer is that Kobe is a densely packed city sitting right on the fault line. But the soft soil and landfill which surround Osaka Bay were also a major factor. When an earthquake rumbles under these waterlogged soils, they become unstable, like quicksand. This was a huge problem in Kobe, because the sections of the city with poor soil were the most densely developed areas ever hit by a quake. But the soil conditions weren't the only reason for the damage.
I think the big lesson in Kobe is that engineering matters. It was possible to stand in Kobe at a single street corner and look around and see buildings that were totally destroyed, buildings that had been built in the immediate post-war period. At another corner, perhaps a Japanese home had been completely flattened. But on the same corner, there would be a more modern building which would have maybe a few exterior cracks and no damage at all. So it's clear that engineering matters.
The most dramatic engineering lesson was delivered by the Hanshin Expressway. This elevated four-lane road is one of Kobe's main thoroughfares, but immediately after the earthquake, it came to symbolize the city's plight. How was it that a massive structure like this could be tipped on its side like a giant tinker toy? Part of the reason was its proximity to the fault and its outmoded design, which dated back almost 40 years. Some of the expressway's supporting columns were made of concrete, which was stiff and not flexible enough to handle the shaking. Inside each column were a series of steel rods. These should have been wrapped with enough steel reinforcement to prevent bending and breaking. But there wasn't enough reinforcement to prevent some of the concrete columns from failing and even breaking apart. Ironically, the Hanshin had been scheduled for retrofitting to meet modern building codes. But the work had been delayed because the earthquake risk was considered low. But the most vulnerable buildings in Kobe, and a major source of casualties, were the traditional homes with weak wooden walls and heavy tile roofs, which were built for a different kind of disaster.
One of the problems that Kobe faced is that the style of buildings are in part optimized to resist hurricanes, which is another threat in the area. So they tend to have tile roofs where they put huge chunks of rocks on them and whatnot so the tiles don't fly off during the hurricanes. But these very heavy roofs on the wooden buildings were very poor for earthquakes.
Given Kobe's history of natural disasters, some might wonder why the city was so vulnerable, especially because the Japanese are so aware of earthquakes. After all, they live atop a myriad of fault lines.
Earthquakes are a part of everyday life in Japan. People talk about earthquakes as they do the weather in the U.S. And because of that, people are very conscious of earthquakes here, and there's a lot of emphasis on research. People are very interested. The common person actually knows quite a bit of seismology, and so it really is part of Japanese life here with the seismic activity.
Most of the earthquakes are relatively harmless. But when they happen, there's one question in the back of everyone's mind. Could this be the big one? Tokyo. The capital of Japan is just 280 miles away from Kobe, but the two cities seem worlds apart. 14 million people live here. Tokyo is the biggest, fastest, flashiest, and the most expensive city in this part of the world. In the matter of earthquakes, it also seems to have cornered the market. While Kobe hadn't felt a significant quake in 4 centuries, it's a rare day when Tokyo doesn't have one. Within every 24-hour period, the city shakes with a small tremor. Most are barely detectable, but it's a constant reminder of the seismic hazard below. Emergency drills are also a routine part of life in Tokyo. They are required for schools and many businesses. The atmosphere may be lighthearted, but there is a serious purpose to this exercise. Deep in the Japanese consciousness lurks one fearful event: the Great Tokyo Earthquake of 1923.
The Japanese face an almost incalculable threat from earthquakes. It's embedded in the national psyche in a way that isn't the case here. Imagine an earthquake taking out a significant chunk of the population in New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. That's basically what Tokyo is for Japan.
At the turn of the century, Tokyo had begun to blend its Asian past with modern Western culture. Most of the city was comprised of small, low-rise wooden buildings. On September 1st, 1923, a date still commemorated in Japan, the Great Shock came. An 8.3 magnitude earthquake hit the flat area around Tokyo Bay called the Kanto Plain.
Again, it was a situation where you had this large fault that hit right underneath a populated area. The fault actually came up someplace underneath Yokohama and Tokyo, and so the whole city was shaken very hard, and then there was large fires afterwards. At that time, many of the structures were wooden, and so once a fire started, it just swept through the area.
The firestorm consumed 2/3 of the city. Modern Tokyo, it is feared, could be ravaged by a similar earthquake, and for that reason, the threat to other cities in Japan, like Kobe, have been overlooked.
The Japanese consider that their chief vulnerability is just to the south of Tokyo, what they call the Tokai Gap. And they have put most of their eggs in the basket of trying to predict or forecast that earthquake. Yes, they have faults all over the islands, but they don't consider, probably correctly, that any of those faults are as active as some of the Tokai Gap area.
Tokyo was always the focal point. But it's really the whole country that's at peril.
Japan is geological Disneyland. Everything is happening there. So you really can't miss it. In Japan, it's all happening. Every kind of plate interaction, and that means every kind of earthquake, every kind of volcano.
Japan owes all this violent activity to its place on the globe, sitting close to the convergence of 4 major pieces of the Earth's crust, called tectonic plates.
And where tectonic plates collide, you get all the stress buildup and you get a lot of earthquakes. So there's major earthquakes offshore caused by the tectonic movements, and there's major earthquakes inland because of all the stresses that these plate movements are putting on the islands of Japan.
The stresses on the Japanese landscape are titanic. Under the ocean, the Pacific plate is pushing or subducting beneath the Philippine plate, and the Philippine plate, in turn, is subducting beneath the Eurasian plate. Over millions of years, this tectonic action created the Japanese islands. The plates move only inches per year, but with enormous force. When sections get stuck and then break free, they create earthquakes. The big subduction faults are capable of creating the world's biggest earthquakes. But even the smaller faults are able to produce Kobe-sized earthquakes of magnitude 7. Both kinds of faults run under or near Tokyo. The capital area is menaced by a multitude of earthquake faults. In large part, the Japanese responded to this danger by starting a program to predict when and where the next earthquake might strike.
The earthquake program in Japan really got started in the early 70s. It's very similar to the U.S.
And at that time, there was a very high optimism that earthquakes could be predicted. There were some interesting observations, and people really thought, both in Japan and the U.S., that in maybe 10 or 20 years, there would be some very practical earthquake predictions happening.
The Tokyo government poured billions of yen into the prediction program. Then, in 1975, they received encouraging news from China. On the morning of February 4th, Chinese scientists predicted an earthquake for the northern Chinese city of Haicheng. 9 hours later, they were right. A big earthquake, magnitude 7.4, rocked the city. Because of the warning, thousands evacuated to safety. The death toll of 1,300 was considered small for a Chinese earthquake. It seemed to confirm Japan's faith in the idea that earthquakes could be predicted. But just 1 year later, outside Beijing, came an even greater shock, a 7.8 magnitude quake. This time, there was no prediction and no evacuation. Some Western scientists believe over 600,000 people died. For many experts, the promise of prediction faded away.
What happened in the United States is we lost the confidence that we were going to predict earthquakes and said, look, if we can't predict earthquakes, then let's do all the other things that we can do.
But the Japanese continued to emphasize prediction over preparation.
The Japanese kind of held on to this hope or this belief that they were going to predict it. And they worked themselves into a position where it became very difficult to say, hey, we can't do it. Or at least we can't do it today.
But then came the Kobe shock of January 17, 1995. Since then, getting ready for an earthquake, not trying to predict it, has become the priority.
They've recognized that prevention measures need to be much more strongly emphasized than they have in the past. They're now putting much more emphasis on questions that will be important for earthquake engineering and other ways of achieving earthquake safety.
What's really impressive about the Japanese is they got the lesson. They're spending 10 times more than we are on earthquakes right now. They have developed a much better national infrastructure. I think it would be fair to say that in some senses, Japan has responded more fully and fundamentally to its bitter lessons at Kobe than we have done to our bitter lessons at Northridge.
Inevitably, Tokyo will have an earthquake. When Tokyo shakes, the world will shudder. Is there any way the Japanese capital can get ready in time to prevent a disaster?
This earthquake will happen. We don't know when it will, but eventually they will get a large earthquake in the Tokyo area. We aren't going to stop the earthquakes. They've happened for thousands of years and they will continue to, but we can live with them. We can live with them by making our cities survivable, making the bridges and the buildings stand up to the large shaking that will happen. There's going to be damage. We can't avoid that, and so we also have to prepare the emergency response.
When that inevitable earthquake strikes, this monitoring center in Tokyo will detect it. The Japanese are taking the threat of earthquakes and the ensuing fires very seriously. This room stands ready for disaster. Instantly, it will become the command center, with staff members coordinating the emergency response efforts.
The population in Japan is far more prepared than our population. They do have evacuation drills. People know what to do. And that's a very large factor. If people don't panic, lives are saved.
But elaborate preparation can only mitigate the disaster, not prevent it. Tokyo is one of the largest and most densely populated cities in the world. It is a major player in global finance. Add a large earthquake, and disaster is inevitable and almost incalculable.
It's really difficult to say what an earthquake is going to do in Tokyo, but when we see the devastation that happened in Kobe, when a large earthquake and strong shaking affects a very densely populated city, it's very easy to imagine that there's going to be very heavy damage in Tokyo, that there could be thousands or tens of thousands of buildings that come down. There could be thousands of casualties. It really is very worrisome to imagine what a large earthquake is going to do to Tokyo.
Tokyo's risk is fire. People live very, very close together. Fire is a very, very big risk. It's almost impossible to have an earthquake that doesn't rupture some gas lines and cause some fires.
It is a huge problem. And the density of people, the narrowness of the streets, the thousands and thousands of buildings that will be collapsing will just completely overwhelm the emergency response. The Tokyo Fire Department and other emergency responders, very professional, very responsive, but it's really just a huge problem that any society would have difficulty being prepared for such a rare and catastrophic event.
Beyond the physical damage, a large earthquake in Tokyo could have strong economic aftershocks.
It's expected that if the 1923 earthquake recurred, it would be $1 trillion event. And that would have consequences for everybody, because the Japanese would have to withdraw all of the money they have in the U.S. equities market, in the global economy, to rebuild Tokyo. And we would all feel that because it underpins so much of our own savings.
Looking at Kobe today, it is hard to tell that the city was ever visited by disaster. For the people who live here, Kobe's recovery has helped to cope with the pain. Aside from a few vacant lots, the city's reconstruction is nearly complete. Emotionally, the wounds may never fully heal. Yet in the subtle and solemn web of Japanese tradition, the changes have been profound.
The Kobe earthquake was not just a physical earthquake, it was also a cultural earthquake because it called into question so many bedrock beliefs of the Japanese. It called into question the whole concept that volunteerism doesn't exist in Japan, and the quake showed flowering of volunteerism. It showed bureaucrats unable to respond to crisis.
Every time I have a chance to talk about the earthquake to people, I always feel like I want to forget about it. But at the same time, I think, as one who has gone through the earthquake, I shouldn't forget about it. And I should keep talking about it to people and to the next generation. To not forget about the people who lost their lives in the earthquake. Not to waste the meanings of the deaths of these people.
At a neighborhood cemetery, a Kobe family commemorates the passing of their young son, a victim of the earthquake. In the years since the tragedy, Sunflowers have become a symbol of the city's recovery. They are also a sign of change in Japan, as well as a subtle reminder. Remember Kobe. Honor her dead. Hope that they have not died in vain. And pray that the lessons from the city by Osaka Bay will not be forgotten.